Zion Cox, 44, owned a small furniture restoration shop in Des Moines, Iowa. Most people saw a tired man in old work boots and a faded flannel shirt. When his wife stood in court and told the judge he had never provided for their family, nobody looked surprised. What they didn't know was that Zion had quietly financed properties worth millions across the Midwest. Then he noticed the accountant, sitting behind Rebecca. The same accountant who had once... Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. And if you enjoy stories where patience beats arrogance and facts beat accusations, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter. Worked for him. 15 years before Rebecca Cox stood in a courtroom and claimed her husband had never provided for their family, she met Zion Cox under the bright summer lights of the Iowa State Fair. The evening smelled like grilled corn, fried dough, and fresh-cut hay. Country music drifted from a stage near the livestock barns. People laughed. Teenagers carried oversized stuffed animals won at carnival games. Zion was 29, Rebecca was 26. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him. He wasn't the loudest man in the crowd. He wasn't dressed like a banker or a lawyer. He wore blue jeans, a gray work shirt, and boots covered with sawdust from a job he had finished earlier that day. Rebecca noticed him because he helped an elderly couple whose pickup truck had stalled near a parking area. Most people walked around the problem. Zion walked toward it. 20 minutes later, the truck started. The old couple offered him money. He refused. Rebecca watched the entire thing. That was how their first conversation began. Over coffee the next week, Zion talked very little about himself. He asked questions instead, about her family, about her dreams, about the places she wanted to visit. Rebecca liked that. At the time, she described him to friends as steady, reliable, different. 16 months later, they were married in a small church outside Des Moines. The reception took place in a rented community hall. Nothing extravagant, no designer decorations, no luxury venue, no expensive wedding planner, just family, friends, homemade food, and music. Rebecca seemed happy. So did Zion. The first years were difficult. Zion's furniture restoration business occupied an aging brick building on the east side of Des Moines. The roof leaked during heavy rain. The heating system failed twice during winter. Some months were good, others were not. There were weeks when Zion worked 6 days straight, sometimes 7. He restored antique dining tables, church pews, historic cabinets, hand-carved furniture from old Iowa farmhouses. Customers appreciated his craftsmanship, but craftsmanship alone rarely made people rich. At least that was what most people believed. Every morning, Zion left the house before sunrise. Every evening, he returned smelling faintly of wood dust and furniture polish. Rebecca often found him sitting at the kitchen table after midnight. Stacks of papers surrounded him. Contracts, invoices, property reports, financial statements. When she asked what he was working on, he usually gave simple answers. Business stuff, future projects, investment paperwork, nothing more. He never liked discussing money, not because he didn't understand it, because he believed talking about it accomplished very little. While restoring furniture paid the bills, Zion had quietly begun investing in commercial properties. The first purchase was a small warehouse outside Council Bluffs. Most people ignored buildings like that. Old loading docks, cracked pavement, rusting metal doors. Zion saw something else: opportunity. The warehouse cost less than many suburban homes. He renovated it slowly, leased it to a regional shipping company. 3 years later, he sold it for nearly triple what he paid. Then he bought another property, then another, then another. He formed holding companies, created trusts, reinvested profits, built partnerships. Each step happened quietly. No announcements, no social media posts, no expensive cars, no flashy office. The furniture shop remained exactly where it had always been. To outsiders, nothing appeared different. Rebecca knew some investments existed. She just never understood how large they had become, partly because she never asked, partly because Zion never volunteered details. As the years passed, their financial situation improved dramatically. They moved into a larger home in West Des Moines. Logan was born. Private school became possible. Family vacations became normal. Medical expenses were never a concern. Bills always disappeared before Rebecca had to think about them. A new roof appeared when the old one needed replacement. A new SUV appeared when the previous vehicle became unreliable. College savings accounts quietly grew. Rebecca rarely handled any of it. Zion took care of everything. At first she appreciated that. Later she stopped noticing it. That was when things slowly began changing. The changes weren't dramatic, not at first. Rebecca joined charity committees, social clubs, fundraising organizations, networking groups. Many members came from wealthy families. Some were married to surgeons, others owned law firms, several ran technology companies. Rebecca enjoyed their company. She enjoyed the restaurants, the parties, the conversations, the appearance of success. And gradually she became uncomfortable with how different Zion seemed from those men. At fundraising dinners, he often wore simple suits. When people talked about luxury vacations, he listened more than he spoke. When conversations turned to wealth, he usually changed the subject. Rebecca noticed. And eventually, she began comparing him to everyone else. One evening at a charity event inside the Des Moines Embassy Club, she watched several executives arrive in luxury vehicles. A Bentley, a Porsche, a Mercedes S-Class. Zion arrived in his aging Ford Ranger. Rebecca's smile disappeared. She didn't say anything that night, but something shifted after that small comment started appearing. You could buy something nicer. You should dress differently. People notice these things. You don't look successful. Zion usually responded with silence, or a shrug, or a simple smile. He never argued. The comments became more frequent over the next few years. Rebecca cared increasingly about appearances. Zion cared increasingly little. The gap widened, and neither of them truly addressed it. What Rebecca saw as ambition, Zion saw as distraction. What Zion viewed as contentment, Rebecca began viewing as limitation. The marriage slowly developed invisible cracks, not explosive fights, not dramatic betrayals, just distance. Distance built from different priorities, different values, different definitions of success. One rainy October evening, Zion returned home after inspecting a warehouse acquisition near Cedar Rapids. He found Rebecca sitting alone in the kitchen. The television was off. A half-finished glass of wine sat beside her. The house felt unusually quiet. She looked at him for several seconds before speaking. "I've been thinking." Zion set down his keys. The tone in her voice felt unfamiliar. He pulled out a chair, sat across from her. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, neither of them moved. Then Rebecca finally said the words that would eventually bring them both into courtroom 4B years later. "I don't think this marriage is working anymore." Zion didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at her, calm, still, listening, because deep down he already suspected this conversation had been coming for a very long time. Zion Cox did not respond when Rebecca told him she was unhappy. He listened. That was what he usually did. The rain continued tapping against the kitchen windows while the silence stretched between them. Rebecca eventually stood from her chair. "I don't want to fight," she said. Zion nodded. Neither of them raised their voices that night. There were no broken dishes, no dramatic accusations, no ultimatums. Just two people sitting across from each other, realizing they were no longer looking toward the same future. In the months that followed, life continued almost normally, at least on the surface. Rebecca remained active in her social circles. Zion continued working. Logan continued attending Jefferson Academy, one of the highest-rated private schools in central Iowa. The tuition alone exceeded $24,000 per year. Every payment arrived on time, every semester, every year. Rebecca never had to worry about it. The same was true for almost everything else. The mortgage payment for their 4-bedroom home in West Des Moines, the insurance premiums, the utilities, the property taxes, the maintenance costs, the medical bills, the credit card balances, the college savings account Zion had opened for Logan years earlier. All of it happened quietly. Most of the transactions never touched their joint checking account. That was one reason Rebecca rarely understood where the money actually came from. Many payments flowed through holding companies, trusts, and business accounts that Zion controlled. The system had been designed years earlier by attorneys and financial planners. It protected assets, reduced liability, simplified business operations. For Zion, it was practical. For someone who didn't understand the structure, it was nearly invisible. Rebecca noticed only the final result. Bills disappeared, services continued, life remained comfortable. As time passed, comfort slowly transformed into expectation, and expectation transformed into entitlement. One Friday afternoon, Rebecca met several friends for lunch at a restaurant in downtown Des Moines called 801 Chop House. The women often gathered there after charity events or fundraising meetings. Rebecca enjoyed those afternoons. The conversations rarely stayed on one topic. Vacations, investments, schools, homes, cars, success, status, image. That afternoon, one woman talked about her husband's new lake house near Okoboji. Another discussed a luxury trip through Italy. A third mentioned purchasing a vacation property in Scottsdale, Arizona. Rebecca smiled along with everyone else, but internally she felt increasingly uncomfortable. Not because her life was difficult, because she felt she was falling behind. She looked successful, yet she believed the people around her saw through the image. When the conversation shifted toward careers, someone casually asked what Zion was doing these days. Rebecca hesitated. Then she laughed lightly. "He still works with old furniture." The table chuckled politely. One woman raised an eyebrow. "That's sweet." Rebecca forced a smile. The conversation moved on, but the moment stayed with her. Later that evening, while driving home in her Cadillac Escalade, she replayed those words in her head. "That's sweet." The phrase irritated her more than she wanted to admit, not because it was insulting, because she feared it was dismissive. She wanted people to see her family differently. She wanted them to see success, power, influence, prestige. The problem was that Zion never cared about those things. A week later, she attended another event, then another. The pattern repeated, again and again, and gradually the way she described her husband began changing. Not all at once, just a little each time. When someone asked about Zion's business, she minimized it. When someone mentioned finances, she implied things were tight. When someone praised their lifestyle, she suggested she was the one holding everything together. The statements became increasingly detached from reality. At first, Zion never heard any of it. Then one evening, he did. The event took place at a fundraiser hosted by the Children's Hospital Foundation. The ballroom was filled with donors, executives, physicians, and local business owners. Zion attended because Rebecca asked him to. He spent most of the evening near the back of the room, speaking with a hospital administrator about renovation work on a historic property. As he crossed the ballroom later that night, he heard Rebecca's voice. She stood with 3 women near the bar. None of them noticed him. "Honestly," Rebecca said with a laugh, "if I didn't stay on top of everything, we'd probably be struggling." One of the women looked surprised. "I thought your husband owned several businesses." Rebecca shrugged. "Not really." Another sip of wine, another small laugh. "He keeps himself busy. That's about it." The women nodded. The conversation continued. Zion quietly turned away before hearing the rest. His expression never changed. He walked outside. The cool Iowa air hit his face. For several moments, he stood alone beneath the lights of the parking lot. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way most people would expect. What he felt was something quieter, disappointment. Because the person speaking inside that ballroom sounded very different from the woman he married 15 years earlier. When Rebecca returned home later that evening, Zion never mentioned what he had heard. He simply continued with life. That was his nature. He did not chase arguments. He did not demand apologies. He did not try to win conversations. Instead, he paid attention. And when Zion paid attention, he noticed details, small things, repeated things, patterns. Over the next several months, he began seeing financial activity that seemed unusual. Nothing dramatic at first. A consulting payment, a transfer, a business expense that didn't make sense. Then another and another. The amounts were relatively small compared to Zion's overall finances. $5,000, $8,000, $12,000. Yet they followed a pattern. Each transaction seemed connected to services Rebecca had never discussed. Most people would have confronted their spouse immediately. Zion did not. He preferred facts over assumptions. One evening, after closing the furniture shop, he sat alone in his office. Stacks of paperwork covered the desk. Outside, snow drifted across the empty parking lot. Inside, only a desk lamp illuminated the room. He opened several financial reports, compared transaction histories, cross-referenced dates, names, accounts, invoices. Eventually, one name appeared repeatedly. Grant Holloway. Zion stared at the screen. The name immediately felt familiar. Very familiar. Grant had worked with him years ago, not as a partner, not as an executive, as a contract accountant. Grant had reviewed financial statements for several of Zion's companies during a period of rapid expansion. He knew the structures, the trusts, the holding companies, the asset flow, not every detail, but enough, far more than most people. Zion leaned back in his chair. The office suddenly felt colder. Grant's name appeared on consulting invoices linked to Rebecca. Monthly payments, financial planning services, advisory fees, business consulting. The descriptions were vague, almost intentionally vague. Perhaps there was a harmless explanation. Perhaps not. Zion continued digging. More records, more invoices, more dates. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Grant was no longer simply a former accountant. Somehow he had become involved in Rebecca's financial affairs. That realization bothered Zion more than anything he had heard at the fundraiser, because unlike gossip, unlike social appearances, unlike careless words, financial records rarely lied. Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside, Zion printed several documents and placed them into a folder, then another, then another. He wasn't preparing for a confrontation, not yet. He was preparing for clarity. Because years of business experience had taught him one lesson above all others. People could say almost anything. Documents usually told the truth. As he locked the office and headed toward the parking lot that night, one question stayed in his mind. Why was Grant Holloway suddenly working with Rebecca? And what exactly were they planning? He would soon discover the answer. But not before the situation became far more serious than he imagined. The first time Zion Cox met Grant Holloway, neither man paid much attention to the other. It had been nearly 9 years earlier. At the time, Zion's business interests were expanding faster than expected. The furniture restoration shop still operated in Des Moines, but behind the scenes, multiple companies were growing across Iowa and Nebraska. Warehouses, distribution facilities, commercial properties, leasing partnerships, investment trusts. The structure had become too complex for a single accountant. One of Zion's attorneys recommended Grant Holloway. Grant came with impressive credentials, certified public accountant, former senior analyst at a regional accounting firm in Omaha, strong references, years of experience handling corporate reporting. The recommendation appeared solid. Zion hired him on a consulting contract. At first, everything seemed normal. Grant was organized, punctual, detail-oriented. He worked efficiently. For nearly 18 months, he reviewed financial reports and helped prepare quarterly statements for several holding companies. Because of that role, Grant gained access to information very few people knew existed. He saw warehouse acquisitions before they became public. He reviewed trust structures. He understood how revenue moved between operating companies and holding entities. He saw the real numbers, not the numbers visible to outsiders, the real numbers. Most people in Des Moines believed Zion owned a furniture restoration shop. Grant knew better. He knew the restoration business represented only a fraction of Zion's holdings. At the time, that information did not seem dangerous. Grant was a professional, a trusted advisor, someone paid to protect confidential information. Then small problems began appearing. Nothing dramatic at first. An incorrect reporting category. A delayed filing, a discrepancy between two reports. Errors happen, especially when businesses grow quickly. Zion did not immediately worry, but over time the mistakes became harder to ignore. One issue involved depreciation schedules on a warehouse portfolio. Another involved reporting classifications. Then came a problem involving a financing disclosure that required correction before submission. Each issue by itself was manageable. Together they created a pattern. Zion noticed. His attorneys noticed. Outside auditors noticed. Meetings followed. Corrections followed. Grant always had explanations. Sometimes the explanations were reasonable. Sometimes they were not. What concerned Zion most was not the mistakes themselves. It was Grant's attitude toward them. He rarely accepted responsibility. There was always another reason, another excuse, another person who supposedly shared blame. That bothered Zion. Not because he expected perfection, because accountability mattered. One afternoon, Zion sat in a conference room reviewing reports with his legal team. The discussion lasted nearly 3 hours. At the end, the conclusion became unavoidable. Grant was no longer the right fit. The termination was professional, respectful. No accusations, no lawsuits, no public conflict. Grant received payment for completed work. The contract ended. Both men moved on. Or at least Zion believed they had. Years passed. Life continued. Business expanded. Logan grew older. The memory of Grant Holloway faded into the background. Until now. Until Zion began seeing his name connected to Rebecca. That was what unsettled him. Not because Grant had once worked for him, because Grant knew things, important things, things that could become useful in a divorce. One Thursday morning, Zion sat inside his office reviewing the newest batch of documents. The printer hummed quietly beside his desk. Stacks of papers covered the work table. Several invoices carried Grant's name. The consulting fees alone exceeded $50,000 over the previous year. That number made Zion pause. $50,000 was not casual financial advice. It suggested ongoing involvement, ongoing planning, ongoing strategy. He studied the dates. The pattern revealed something troubling. Grant's consulting arrangement appeared to begin shortly before Rebecca first mentioned divorce, not afterward, before. That detail stayed in Zion's mind for the rest of the day. That evening, he drove home through downtown Des Moines. Traffic moved slowly. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement. The city looked peaceful. Yet something about the timing continued bothering him. When he arrived home, Rebecca was sitting on the patio scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up. "You're late." "I had work." She nodded without interest. The conversation ended there. Years earlier, they would have talked for hours. Now, entire evenings passed with only a handful of sentences. Zion walked inside. The house felt strangely empty despite its size. Logan was at basketball practice. Rebecca remained outside. The silence seemed louder than usual. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Zion returned to his home office. The room overlooked the backyard. Rain tapped softly against the glass. He opened another folder. More invoices, more consulting records. Then he found something new, an email chain. The document appeared among files attached to one of the consulting payments. Most of the message had been redacted, but a few visible lines remained. One sentence caught his attention immediately. "We need to establish what can be documented regarding his actual contributions." Zion read it twice, then a third time. His expression remained calm, but his focus sharpened. The wording felt deliberate, not emotional, strategic, carefully chosen. He continued reading. The remaining fragments revealed little. Yet the implication was difficult to ignore. Someone was building a narrative, a financial narrative, a version of reality that could eventually be presented to attorneys or a court. And Grant appeared involved. Zion printed the email, added it to the growing folder, then leaned back in his chair. Outside, the rain intensified. For several minutes, he simply sat there thinking. Not about revenge, not about winning, about preparation. Business had taught him a simple lesson years ago. Problems rarely appeared suddenly. They announced themselves through patterns. Most people ignored those patterns, then acted surprised when consequences arrived. Zion preferred another approach. Observe, document, verify, prepare. That approach had protected him in business. Now it might protect him somewhere else. The following week brought another surprise. A certified envelope arrived at the house. The return address belonged to a law firm in Des Moines. Rebecca had officially retained counsel. The paperwork confirmed what Zion already suspected. The marriage was ending. The filing itself did not shock him. The timing did, because several statements contained within the preliminary documents appeared strangely familiar. Descriptions of financial dependency, descriptions of unequal contributions, descriptions minimizing Zion's role in supporting the household. The language sounded almost technical, almost financial, almost as if someone with accounting experience had helped construct it. Grant's shadow seemed to appear everywhere. Yet Zion still did not react publicly. He did not confront Rebecca. He did not call Grant. He did not send angry messages. Instead, he called one person, Victoria Bennett. If Grant represented the past, Victoria represented preparation. She was one of the few attorneys who knew the complete structure of Zion's holdings. Years earlier, she had helped create several trusts and asset protection entities. She understood the paperwork better than anyone. More importantly, she understood Zion. She answered on the second ring. Victoria Bennett. It's Zion. A brief pause, then her tone changed. Something's happened. Yes. You sound calm. I am. Another pause. What do you need? Zion looked at the folder sitting on his desk. The stack was growing larger by the day. Invoices, emails, financial records, questions, patterns, evidence. Finally, he answered. I think it's time we opened the old files. Victoria was silent for a moment. Then she said 4 words. Bring everything you have. For the first time since seeing Grant's name appear beside Rebecca's finances, Zion felt certain about one thing. The next stage of this fight would not be decided by accusations. It would be decided by documents. And somewhere inside those documents, the truth was waiting. Victoria Bennett's office occupied the top floor of a brick building overlooking the Des Moines River. The view was impressive. Victoria rarely noticed it. People did not hire her for scenery. They hired her because she prepared more thoroughly than almost anyone else. On a gray Monday morning, Zion Cox arrived carrying 2 cardboard boxes. By noon, there were 6. Each one was filled with records, bank statements, property agreements, tax filings, trust documents, insurance records, school tuition payments, medical invoices, mortgage records, utility statements, years of paperwork. Most clients arrived at a lawyer's office with stories. Zion arrived with evidence. Victoria watched as the final box was placed beside her conference table. You've been busy. Zion gave a slight shrug. I keep records. That was an understatement. Victoria opened the nearest box. Inside, every document had been organized by year. Color-coded tabs separated categories. Supporting records were attached to primary reports. Nothing appeared random. Nothing appeared rushed. The preparation reflected exactly the kind of man Zion was. Methodical, patient, quiet. Victoria removed her glasses and studied him for a moment. Most people facing divorce looked exhausted, angry, emotional, desperate. Zion looked like the businessman preparing for an audit. What are you expecting? She asked. I don't know yet. That's not true. He leaned back slightly. I think someone is building a financial case, Victoria nodded. And I think Grant Holloway is helping. That answer immediately captured her attention. She knew the name. Years earlier, she had encountered Grant during corporate reporting reviews. Not often, but enough. Victoria walked toward a large whiteboard mounted on the wall. She wrote 2 names. Rebecca Cox, Grant Holloway. Then she turned back toward Zion. Tell me everything. For nearly 3 hours, Zion explained what he had discovered. The consulting invoices, the payment history, the email fragments, the timing, the conversations, the gradual changes in Rebecca's behavior. Victoria listened carefully, occasionally taking notes, occasionally asking questions, mostly listening. When Zion finished, she sat quietly for several moments. Then she opened the first box. The work began. Hours passed. The conference room slowly disappeared beneath stacks of documents. By late afternoon, Victoria had already identified something important. A pattern. Every major expense within the household traced back to Zion, not some of them, almost all of them. Mortgage payments, private school tuition, vehicle financing, insurance premiums, medical expenses, property taxes, household improvements, vacation costs, investment contributions. Everything had supporting documentation. Victoria pulled a tuition statement from Jefferson Academy. $24,000, paid in full. She found the payment record, then the bank transfer, then the source account. The documentation formed a complete chain. Nothing was missing. Next came medical expenses. Rebecca's mother had undergone surgery several years earlier. The procedure cost nearly $70,000 after insurance adjustments. Victoria found the hospital invoices, then the payment confirmations, then the originating account. Again, everything led back to Zion. She opened another folder, then another, then another. The pattern never changed. The deeper she looked, the stronger Zion's position became. Yet something else began attracting her attention. Certain names kept appearing throughout the records: vendors, consultants, financial service providers. Most meant nothing. One name appeared repeatedly: Grant Holloway. Victoria circled it with a red pen, then circled it again. The references stretched back years, much further than Zion initially realized. Some involved corporate reporting, others involved consulting work. A few related to tax planning reviews. Nothing unusual by itself, but together they established something important. Grant possessed extensive knowledge of Zion's financial history. That fact alone could become significant. By early evening, Victoria ordered dinner from a nearby steakhouse. Neither of them left the office. The work continued. While reviewing archived corporate records from 7 years earlier, Victoria suddenly stopped turning pages. She looked down again, then leaned closer. A document sat beneath her hand, simple, ordinary, easy to overlook. Yet her expression changed immediately. Zion noticed. "What is it?" Victoria didn't answer right away. She carefully removed the page, placed it on the table, then slid it toward him. The document was an internal financial review prepared during Grant's consulting period. Several signatures appeared at the bottom. One belonged to Grant, another belonged to an auditor, a third belonged to Zion. At first glance, the report seemed unremarkable. Then Zion saw the highlighted section. The review specifically identified trust distributions used to support family expenses. Tuition, mortgage payments, insurance obligations, household costs. Everything was listed. Everything was documented. Most importantly, Grant had personally certified the accuracy of the report. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Victoria broke the silence. "If Grant is helping Rebecca claim you didn't support the household," she tapped the page, "he already knows this exists." Zion looked at the document. The realization settled heavily. Not because it surprised him, because it confirmed something. Grant wasn't operating from ignorance. He knew the facts. He had known them for years. Victoria continued searching. More reports emerged. More signatures. More confirmations. Each one strengthened the same conclusion. Grant had repeatedly reviewed and approved records showing Zion's financial support. That fact could become extremely important later. The following morning, Victoria arrived before sunrise, coffee in one hand, legal pad in the other. She spent hours building timelines, creating spreadsheets, organizing evidence. By midday, a clear picture had emerged. The evidence did not simply show Zion contributing to the household. It showed Zion carrying almost every major financial responsibility for over a decade. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars in documented support. Every dollar traceable. Every dollar supported by records. Then Victoria found something unexpected. A transfer report. The transaction itself was not unusual. What caught her attention was the destination. The receiving entity did not match any company she recognized. Victoria checked again, then searched corporate records. The company existed. A limited liability corporation, recently formed. Ownership information appeared partially shielded. That alone was unusual, not illegal, just unusual. She printed the records, placed them in a separate folder, a growing folder, one labeled Questions. Later that afternoon, Zion returned to the office. Victoria spread several documents across the conference table. "We've confirmed something." Zion sat down. Victoria pointed toward the evidence. "If Rebecca argues you failed to support the family, the records don't just contradict her." She paused. "They destroy the argument." Zion said nothing. Victoria continued. "But that's not the interesting part." She slid another document forward. The newly discovered LLC. The unexplained transfers. The unusual ownership structure. Zion studied the paperwork. The name meant nothing to him. Have you seen this before? No, Victoria nodded. I didn't think so, she folded her hands, which means we need to find out why money is flowing there. The room became quiet. Outside traffic moved along Grand Avenue. Inside, another piece of the puzzle had appeared, a piece neither of them expected, and for the first time since the divorce process began, Victoria looked genuinely intrigued. Because what had started as a simple dispute over financial support was beginning to look like something far more complicated, something hidden, something carefully structured. And somewhere inside thousands of pages of records, the answer was waiting. The first hearing took place on a cold Tuesday morning in early February. Snow covered the sidewalks outside the Polk County Courthouse in downtown Des Moines. People hurried through the wind carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Inside, courtroom 4B felt warmer, but not calmer. Zion Cox arrived 15 minutes early, as usual. He wore a dark navy suit he had owned for years. Nothing expensive, nothing fashionable. The suit fit well enough. That was all he cared about. Victoria Bennett walked beside him, carrying 2 leather binders. One contained procedural documents. The other contained evidence. Neither binder left her sight. Zion paused briefly near the courtroom doors. Around him, attorneys moved through the hallway, discussing schedules and case numbers. Families sat on wooden benches waiting for hearings. Some looked angry, others nervous. Several appeared exhausted. Zion looked none of those things. He simply waited, observing, listening, preparing. A few minutes later, Rebecca arrived. The contrast was noticeable. She wore a tailored cream-colored suit, designer handbag, diamond earrings, perfectly styled hair. Her appearance suggested confidence, control, certainty. Several people turned to look. Rebecca barely acknowledged Zion. She walked past him without speaking. Grant Holloway followed several steps behind. The moment Zion saw him, his attention sharpened. Grant looked older than he remembered. More gray hair, thinner face, slightly heavier posture. But it was definitely him. Grant carried a black portfolio case and several folders. Their eyes met briefly. Neither man smiled. Neither man waved. The acknowledgement lasted less than a second. Then Grant looked away. Victoria noticed. That's him. Yes. You sure? Zion nodded. I've never been more sure. The courtroom doors opened. Everyone entered. Judge Eleanor Hart took the bench precisely at 9 o'clock. She had served on the family court for nearly 2 decades. Lawyers respected her. Clients feared her. Judge Hart had little patience for emotional theater. She preferred evidence, facts, documentation. That reputation was one reason Victoria felt cautiously optimistic. After opening formalities, the hearing began. The purpose was preliminary. Establish positions, review disclosures, determine what issues would require further examination. Simple in theory, important in practice. Rebecca's attorney, Daniel Mercer, stood first. He was experienced, confident, well-spoken. For nearly 20 minutes, he outlined Rebecca's position. The presentation sounded polished, carefully constructed, deliberately framed. According to Mercer, Rebecca had carried much of the family's practical responsibility. According to Mercer, Zion's financial contributions had been inconsistent, difficult to verify, often exaggerated. Victoria wrote notes without interruption. Judge Hart listened quietly. Zion remained completely still. Then Mercer reached the statement that changed the atmosphere. My client will demonstrate that Mr. Cox has not meaningfully provided for the family's financial needs in the manner he now claims. The words hung in the courtroom. Several heads lifted. Several pens stopped moving. Even Judge Hart looked up from her notes. Mercer continued. Our evidence will show a substantial difference between perception and reality. Rebecca sat confidently beside him. For a brief moment, she looked satisfied, as though the statement itself represented a victory. Zion watched without reaction. Only one small detail revealed his focus. His eyes shifted toward Grant. The accountant sat quietly behind Rebecca's legal team, taking notes, reviewing documents, waiting. The hearing moved forward. Judge Hart began asking questions. Basic questions, necessary questions. Who paid the mortgage? Who managed educational expenses? Who handled medical obligations? Who maintained household finances? Mercer answered generally. Rebecca occasionally added details. Victoria remained silent. That silence was intentional. She had no interest in arguing before hearing every claim. Judge Hart eventually turned toward Rebecca. "Mrs. Cox, I want to understand your position clearly." Rebecca straightened slightly. "Yes, Your Honor. You believe your husband failed to provide adequate financial support?" Rebecca nodded. "I do." Judge Hart glanced at her notes. "For how long?" Rebecca hesitated, then answered, "Most of our marriage." The statement settled heavily inside the room. Zion said nothing. Victoria said nothing. Judge Hart continued, "You are testifying that Mr. Cox did not meaningfully support the household financially?" "Yes." "What specifically are you referring to?" Rebecca seemed prepared, perhaps rehearsed. She listed examples: household management, daily responsibilities, financial uncertainty, stress, instability. The description sounded convincing, at least on the surface. Yet one thing quickly became apparent. Specific numbers rarely appeared. Specific dates rarely appeared. Specific documents never appeared, Victoria noticed. So did Judge Hart. Eventually, the judge asked a direct question. "Who paid your son's private school tuition?" Rebecca paused. Only briefly, but the pause existed. "Various sources." Judge Hart looked up. "What does that mean?" Rebecca shifted slightly. "Family resources." The answer sounded vague. Because it was. Judge Hart wrote something in her notebook, then moved to another question. "Who paid the mortgage?" Again Rebecca hesitated. Again the answer lacked clarity. Again Judge Hart wrote something down. From the gallery, Zion observed everything, not emotionally, analytically. Years of business negotiations had taught him to watch patterns. People rarely revealed themselves through major mistakes. They revealed themselves through small ones, tiny inconsistencies, minor evasions, subtle hesitation. Rebecca displayed all three. The hearing continued. Then Mercer called attention to financial consulting work, specifically expert review, specifically accounting analysis, specifically Grant Holloway. The attorney introduced him as a financial consultant familiar with complex asset structures. Technically true. Grant shifted in his chair. Victoria watched carefully. So did Zion. The introduction itself was not surprising, but it confirmed something important. Grant was not merely advising behind the scenes. He was part of the strategy, part of the narrative, part of the case. Judge Hart acknowledged the disclosure, then turned toward Victoria. "Ms. Bennett." Victoria rose, calmly, no rush, no dramatic gestures, just confidence. "Your Honor, we appreciate counsel's summary." She opened one binder, then another. "The respondent intends to provide extensive documentation regarding household support, financial contributions, educational expenses, healthcare obligations, mortgage payments, and family expenditures." Mercer immediately objected. "Documentation has not yet been introduced." Victoria nodded politely. "Correct." Then she paused. "But it exists." The room became quiet. Judge Hart looked interested. Victoria continued. "Thousands of pages exist." That statement landed differently, because everyone knew what it implied: records, proof, evidence. Mercer adjusted his posture. Rebecca looked toward Grant. Grant's expression remained neutral. But Zion noticed something, a small movement. Grant's fingers tightened around his pen, only briefly, then relaxed. Most people would have missed it. Zion did not. Judge Hart requested preliminary disclosures within established deadlines. Both parties agreed. Procedural matters followed: schedules, discovery requests, future hearings, nothing dramatic. Yet beneath the ordinary legal language, tension continued building, because everyone now understood the central issue. One side relied heavily on claims. The other appeared prepared to rely on records. As the hearing approached its conclusion, Judge Hart offered final remarks. Her voice remained measured, professional, direct. "This court is interested in facts." She looked toward both legal teams. "Not assumptions." Then toward Rebecca, then toward Zion. "Documentation will matter." Victoria simply nodded. Mercer did the same. The hearing adjourned shortly afterward. People began gathering files, chairs moved, conversations resumed. The courtroom slowly emptied. Yet before leaving, Zion glanced once more toward Grant Holloway. The accountant was organizing papers inside his portfolio. One document slipped partially free, only for a second. But that second was enough. Zion recognized the format immediately. Corporate reporting records. Records Grant had reviewed years earlier. Records connected to Zion's companies. Grant quickly pushed the page back inside the folder. The movement seemed automatic, instinctive. But Zion had already seen it. A small detail, perhaps meaningless, perhaps not. Outside the courthouse, snow drifted through the cold afternoon air. Victoria and Zion walked toward the parking garage. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Victoria broke the silence. "How do you feel?" Zion looked toward the gray Iowa sky. "Like someone is trying very hard to tell a story," Victoria nodded. "And?" A faint smile appeared. "Stories are easier than records." Victoria smiled for the first time all day, because she had spent the last week reading those records, and she knew exactly what they contained. What neither Rebecca nor Grant realized was that the next hearing would not revolve around opinions. It would revolve around questions, specific questions, questions requiring specific answers. And once those questions started coming, silence would become much harder to maintain. 3 weeks after the first hearing, courtroom 4B felt different. The room was fuller. Word had quietly spread among local attorneys that the Cox divorce was becoming unusually complicated. Cases involving hidden money always attracted attention. Cases involving millions of dollars attracted even more. By 9 o'clock, every seat in the public gallery was occupied. Judge Eleanor Hart entered precisely on schedule. Everyone stood, then sat. The second hearing began. This time the atmosphere carried more tension, less speculation, more anticipation, because both legal teams had exchanged preliminary disclosures, and the disclosures raised questions, a lot of questions. Victoria Bennett arrived with 4 large binders. Daniel Mercer arrived with 2. The difference was noticeable, not because larger binders automatically meant stronger evidence, but because preparation tends to reveal itself through details. Zion sat quietly beside Victoria. As always, his expression gave nothing away. Across the aisle, Rebecca appeared confident. Yet something seemed slightly different. The confidence looked practiced, maintained, not natural. Judge Hart opened her notes. "Today we will address financial disclosures and supporting documentation." Her eyes moved toward Rebecca's side first. "Mr. Mercer." Mercer stood. He began with familiar arguments: financial imbalance, unequal knowledge, limited transparency, complex business structures. The presentation was polished, professional, but Judge Hart interrupted several times. Each interruption focused on specifics. "Do you have documentation? What record supports that statement? What date are you referring to? What amount?" The questions gradually narrowed the discussion, like a funnel. Mercer answered as well as he could, yet many responses remained broad, general, incomplete. Judge Hart wrote notes continuously. Then she turned toward Victoria. "Ms. Bennett." Victoria stood. She opened the first binder. Unlike Mercer, she did not begin with arguments. She began with a question. "Mrs. Cox, may I ask a few clarifying questions?" Rebecca nodded. Judge Hart approved. Victoria walked slowly toward the lectern. No dramatic movements, no raised voice, just calm precision. "Mrs. Cox, who paid Logan's tuition at Jefferson Academy during the last 5 years." Rebecca shifted slightly. "The family paid it." Victoria nodded. "The family?" "Yes. Could you be more specific?" Rebecca glanced briefly toward Mercer, then answered. "We managed it together." Victoria turned a page. "Together." "Yes." Victoria remained polite. "Do you know the annual tuition amount?" Rebecca hesitated. "Approximately." "How much?" A pause. 20,000. Victoria looked down, then back up. "The actual figure averaged slightly above $24,000 annually." Rebecca said nothing. Victoria continued. "Can you identify a single tuition payment made from your personal account?" Mercer objected. Judge Hart allowed limited questioning. Rebecca looked uncomfortable. "I don't remember." Victoria nodded again. A simple answer, but not a helpful one. She moved on. "Let's discuss the mortgage." Another page. Another document. Who paid the monthly mortgage obligation on the West Des Moines property? Rebecca folded her hands. Household funds. Again. Vague. Again. Victoria approached carefully. What specific account? Silence. Several seconds passed. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Rebecca finally answered. I don't know. Victoria wrote something, then turned another page. Who paid for your mother's surgery in 2019? Rebecca blinked. My husband helped. The answer surprised several people, including Mercer, because it represented the first direct acknowledgement of financial support. Victoria immediately noticed. So Mr. Cox paid. He contributed. Victoria nodded. And the remaining balance? Rebecca looked uncertain. I don't remember. Victoria waited, then waited a little longer. The silence became uncomfortable. Finally, Judge Hart spoke. If you don't know, simply say so. Rebecca lowered her eyes briefly. I don't know. Victoria thanked her, then returned to counsel table. The first cracks had appeared, small cracks, but visible. Judge Hart noticed. So did everyone else. After a brief recess, the hearing resumed. This time, Victoria introduced documents. One by one, methodically, tuition records, mortgage records, insurance records, healthcare payments, home renovation invoices. Every document followed the same structure. Expense, payment confirmation, source account, supporting record. The chain remained intact every time. No gaps, no missing links, no assumptions, only documentation. Judge Hart examined several exhibits personally. The judge rarely displayed emotion, yet her growing interest became obvious. Then Victoria presented a summary chart. The chart displayed household expenses across a 7-year period. Columns, dates, amounts, payment sources, everything clearly organized. Several observers in the gallery leaned forward. The numbers were significant. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, year after year, consistently funded through entities controlled by Zion. Mercer objected to portions of the presentation. Some objections succeeded. Most did not. Because the underlying records were authentic, verifiable, traceable, facts tend to survive objections better than opinions. By mid-afternoon, Judge Hart began asking her own questions. That was rarely good news for the side struggling with documentation. She addressed Rebecca directly. Mrs. Cox. Rebecca looked up. You have repeatedly stated that Mr. Cox failed to provide meaningful support. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Hart tapped several exhibits. These records appear to show substantial financial contributions. Rebecca hesitated. The hesitation lasted only a second, but everyone noticed. My point was broader than money. Judge Hart remained expressionless. Today we are discussing finances. Silence followed. The judge turned another page. Do you dispute the authenticity of these records? Mercer immediately intervened. We reserve the right to review all documentation. Judge Hart nodded. A reasonable position. Then she looked toward Victoria. Do additional records exist? Victoria answered immediately. Thousands. The room became quiet again, because everyone understood what that meant. This was only the beginning, only a sample, only a fraction of what had been prepared. Then Judge Hart asked the question Zion had been waiting to hear, the question that shifted attention toward Grant Holloway. Who assisted Mrs. Cox in reviewing these financial matters? Mercer responded first. Financial consultant Grant Holloway. Judge Hart wrote the name down, then looked towards the back of the courtroom. Grant sat perfectly still. The judge continued. Was Mr. Holloway involved in preparing the financial position being presented today? Mercer nodded. To an extent, yes. Judge Hart wrote another note. Victoria remained silent. But Zion noticed something. The same thing he had noticed during the previous hearing. Grant's fingers tightened around his pen, again, only briefly, then relaxed. A tiny reaction. Most people would never notice. Zion did, because he wasn't listening only to words anymore. He was watching behavior, watching pressure, watching uncertainty. The hearing moved toward its conclusion. Judge Hart reviewed scheduling matters, discovery deadlines, future disclosures, witness lists. Then she closed the folder in front of her. The sound echoed softly through the courtroom. One final issue. Everyone looked up. Judge Hart's eyes settled on Victoria. Miss Bennet. Yes, Your Honor. You indicated earlier that Mr. Holloway may possess relevant knowledge concerning historical financial records. Victoria nodded. Yes. Judge Hart looked toward Mercer, then toward Grant, then back to Victoria. Do you intend to call him as a witness? The question seemed simple, yet it changed the entire atmosphere. For the first time all day, Grant looked genuinely uncomfortable. His posture shifted, his jaw tightened, his eyes moved toward Mercer, then toward Rebecca, then away. Victoria waited just long enough for everyone to notice, then answered, Yes, Your Honor. Silence. Complete silence. Judge Hart nodded. When? Victoria closed her binder. At the next hearing. Across the courtroom, Grant's face remained calm. But Zion saw something behind the expression, something new. Not confidence, not control, concern. Because Grant Holloway understood something most people in the room did not. He knew exactly what those old financial records contained, and soon he would have to discuss them under oath. As people gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, Zion remained seated for a moment, watching, thinking. The next hearing would be different. Questions would become sharper, answers would become harder. And for the first time since Rebecca filed for divorce, someone else's version of events would be tested against actual history. Not opinion, not strategy, history. And history had a way of surviving even the most carefully constructed stories. The fourth hearing began on a windy Thursday morning. By then, the Cox divorce had become one of the most talked-about family court cases in Polk County. Not because of scandal, not yet, because of uncertainty. Two completely different stories were colliding inside the same courtroom. Rebecca claimed Zion had failed his family. The documents suggested something very different. And now a new question stood at the center of everything. What did Grant Holloway know? Courtroom 4B filled quickly. Attorneys occupied the front rows. Several law students sat quietly in the gallery. A few local business owners who knew Zion attended as observers. Nobody spoke much. Everyone seemed to understand the importance of the day. Grant Holloway would testify under oath. Judge Eleanor Hart entered. The room rose, then settled. Victoria Bennet reviewed her notes one final time. Zion sat beside her, calm as always. Yet Victoria had worked with him long enough to recognize subtle signs. He was focused, not emotional. Focused. There was a difference. Across the room, Rebecca appeared uneasy for the first time since the proceedings began. The confidence she carried during the earlier hearings had faded slightly. Not disappeared. Just weakened. Because every hearing seemed to produce more records, more questions, more inconsistencies. Judge Hart called the session to order. Procedural matters were handled quickly. Then Victoria stood. Your Honor, the respondent calls Grant Holloway. The room became noticeably quieter. Grant slowly rose from his seat. He adjusted his tie, collected a folder, then walked toward the witness stand. Every step seemed deliberate, measured, careful. The court clerk administered the oath. Grant raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, then sat. Victoria waited several seconds before speaking. She understood something many attorneys overlooked. Silence creates pressure. Pressure creates mistakes. Finally, she approached. Good morning, Mr. Holloway. Good morning. Her tone remained friendly, professional, almost conversational. Would you please state your occupation for the record? I'm a certified public accountant and financial consultant. How long have you worked in that field? Approximately 27 years, Victoria nodded. You're experienced then. I'd like to think so. A few quiet laughs came from the gallery. Even Judge Hart smiled slightly. The atmosphere relaxed. That was exactly what Victoria wanted. People often lowered their guard when conversations felt comfortable. She continued. Mr. Holloway, have you previously worked with Zion Cox? Yes. The answer came easily. No hesitation. No need to avoid the obvious, Victoria thought. She expected that. When did you first begin working with him? Grant gave dates, general descriptions, consulting arrangements, financial reviews, corporate reporting. Nothing controversial. Not yet. Victoria walked slowly toward the evidence table. Would it be fair to say you became familiar with portions of Mr. Cox's financial structure? Grant hesitated, only briefly. To some extent. To some extent, yes. Victoria picked up a document. 1 page, simple, clean. She approached the witness stand. Is this your signature? Grant examined it. Yes. And this report? It appears to be. Prepared while working for Mr. Cox? Yes. Victoria nodded, then handed a copy to Judge Hart, another to opposing counsel, another remained with the witness. The report discussed trust distributions, property holdings, business obligations, household expenditures, nothing confidential anymore. Everything had already entered discovery. Victoria returned to the lectern. Mr. Holloway, according to this report, were you aware of trust distributions used to support the Cox household? Grant shifted slightly. Yes, the answer echoed through the room. Several people looked toward Rebecca. Victoria continued. Were those distributions real? Yes. Documented? Yes. Reviewed by you? Yes. Approved by you? Another pause. Yes. Victoria thanked him, then moved forward, not aggressively, methodically, like someone assembling a puzzle, one piece at a time. Mr. Holloway, were you aware of tuition payments made on behalf of Logan Cox? Yes. Mortgage obligations? Yes. Medical expenses? Yes. Insurance premiums? Yes. Every answer added another brick to the wall. Slowly, steadily. Judge Hart wrote notes continuously. Mercer watched carefully. Rebecca sat motionless. Zion simply observed. Victoria stopped beside the witness stand. Approximately how familiar were you with the financial support provided by Mr. Cox to his family? Grant looked uncomfortable. For the first time all morning, the answer did not arrive immediately. Finally, he spoke. Fairly familiar. Victoria tilted her head slightly. Fairly familiar. Yes. Would you describe yourself as one of the individuals most familiar with those records? Mercer objected. Judge Hart allowed the question. Grant sighed softly, then answered. Probably. The word landed heavily. Probably. Not certainly, but close enough. Victoria let the moment breathe. Then she introduced another exhibit. This one produced a visible reaction, a much stronger reaction. The document came from 7 years earlier, an internal financial certification report. Grant recognized it immediately. So did Zion. Victoria held it up. Mr. Holloway, is this your signature? Grant examined the page. His jaw tightened. Yes. Did you certify the accuracy of this report? Yes. Victoria waited, then asked the question she had prepared weeks earlier. The report states that household expenses were funded through entities controlled by Zion Cox. Is that accurate? The room became silent. Completely silent. Grant looked at the document, then at Victoria, then briefly toward Rebecca. Finally, he answered, yes. No dramatic music, no shouting, no gasps, just one word. Yet that word changed everything, because it came from the person helping support Rebecca's financial narrative. Victoria continued. Were those records accurate when you signed them? Yes. Do you have any evidence suggesting they were inaccurate? No. Another note from Judge Hart. Another crack in the opposing position. Victoria wasn't finished, not even close. She approached the evidence table again. This time she returned carrying a thick ledger, several hundred pages, bound professionally. Color tabs marked important sections. Grant immediately recognized it. Zion noticed. The reaction lasted less than a second. But it existed. And that was enough. Victoria placed the ledger before the witness. Have you seen this document before? Grant nodded. Yes. What is it? A financial ledger. For whom Grant swallowed. The Cox family financial accounts. Victoria let the answer settle, then opened the ledger. Page after page revealed detailed transactions, dates, amounts, sources, recipients, nothing sensational, just facts. Thousands of facts. Mr. Holloway, did you review portions of this ledger during your consulting work? Yes. Extensively. Yes. Did it accurately reflect financial activity? To my knowledge, yes. The room remained silent. Even Mercer had stopped objecting. There was little point. The answers were coming directly from his own side's financial consultant. Victoria flipped several pages, then stopped. A yellow tab marked a specific section. She placed her finger on one transaction, then another, then another. The entries showed mortgage payments, school tuition, insurance premiums, medical expenses, everything flowing from accounts connected to Zion. Mr. Holloway, can you identify the source of these payments? Grant studied the ledger. Several long seconds passed. Then he answered, accounts controlled by Mr. Cox. Victoria nodded. One more piece, one more confirmation, one more layer removed. She closed the ledger, slowly, deliberately, then stepped back. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time. The statement surprised several observers. It felt too early, too simple, too controlled. Victoria returned to counsel table. Zion glanced toward her. She didn't look satisfied. She looked patient, which meant she had accomplished exactly what she intended, because the goal today had never been to destroy Grant. The goal had been to establish facts, facts that could not easily be disputed later. As Mercer prepared for cross-examination, Grant remained seated in the witness chair. His posture seemed heavier now, less certain, because every answer had moved the case in a direction he probably did not expect. And Victoria still had one major piece of evidence she had not revealed, a piece connected to a financial account nobody had discussed publicly, an account that existed far beyond Des Moines, far beyond Iowa, an account hidden behind corporate paperwork and layered transactions, an account whose discovery would change the entire case, and Victoria intended to unveil it very soon. When courtroom 4B reconvened after lunch, the atmosphere had changed, not dramatically, subtly, the kind of change experienced people immediately recognize. Before lunch, Rebecca's legal team had been presenting a story. After lunch, everyone was talking about records, and records were harder to argue with. Grant Holloway remained on the witness stand. His testimony that morning had established something important. He knew Zion Cox's finances. He had reviewed them, certified them, signed off on them. That alone weakened the argument that Zion had failed to support his family. But Victoria Bennett was not finished, not even close. She rose slowly from her chair. No theatrics, no sudden movements, just the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the case. Judge Hart adjusted her glasses. Proceed. Victoria nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. She approached the witness stand carrying a thick binder. The binder contained only one section of evidence: household expenditures. Nothing else. No business valuations. No corporate structures. No trusts. Just household expenses. She placed the binder before Grant, then turned toward the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to walk through several examples. Judge Hart nodded. Victoria opened the binder. The first page appeared on the courtroom monitors. A tuition statement from Jefferson Academy. Year 2018. Amount $24,870. Payment status paid in full. Victoria looked at Grant. Do you recognize this document? Yes. What is it? A tuition statement. For whom? Logan Cox. Victoria pointed to the payment confirmation. Can you identify the source account? Grant examined the document, then answered. A trust distribution account controlled by Mr. Cox. Victoria nodded. The answer was expected. She turned the page. Another tuition statement. Another year. Another payment. Then another. And another. For nearly 10 minutes the pattern repeated. Every year, every payment, every source, the same answer. Controlled by Zion. The gallery grew quieter with each confirmation, because the numbers accumulated quickly. 24,000, 25,000, 26,000, year after year. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, documented, verified, traceable. Victoria moved to the next category, medical expenses. One exhibit displayed invoices from Mercy One Medical Center, another from the University of Iowa hospitals. Another involved Rebecca's mother, the surgery Zion had paid for years earlier. Grant reviewed each record, each payment trail, each source account. His answers remained consistent. The money came from Zion, not occasionally, not partially, consistently. Judge Hart filled page after page with notes. The judge rarely interrupted, which usually meant she was paying close attention. Victoria moved forward. Home improvements, roof replacement, HVAC installation, kitchen renovation, foundation repairs, property taxes, insurance premiums, vehicle financing one by one. Every expense created the same conclusion. Zion had paid. By mid-afternoon, the financial picture had become difficult to ignore. Even Mercer appeared less aggressive than before. His objections became less frequent, less forceful. Because every objection risked highlighting another document, another payment, another record, another fact. Then Victoria introduced something new, a summary chart. The courtroom monitors illuminated with columns of figures. The chart displayed 12 years of household support. The numbers filled the screen. Mortgage payments, education costs, healthcare expenses, insurance obligations, property maintenance, household operations, travel expenditures, emergency expenses. The total appeared at the bottom. Several people in the gallery leaned forward. Even Judge Hart paused. The number exceeded $1.8 million. The room became silent, not shocked, just silent. Because large numbers become difficult to dismiss when they are supported by evidence. Victoria approached the witness stand again. Mr. Holloway, have you reviewed similar financial summaries before? Yes. Would you consider this summary accurate? Grant studied it. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then he answered, yes. The word landed heavily. Another confirmation. Another piece. Another nail in the narrative that Zion had contributed nothing. Victoria thanked him, then closed the binder. Most people expected her to sit down. Instead, she walked toward the evidence table, picked up a much thinner folder, and returned. Zion noticed the folder immediately. So did Grant. The reaction was unmistakable. For the first time all day, Grant's composure visibly weakened. His shoulders tightened, his eyes narrowed slightly, his breathing changed, only slightly, but enough, Victoria noticed. That was exactly why she selected that folder. Inside was not a ledger, not a mortgage record, not a tuition statement. Inside was a question. One very specific question. She opened the folder. Mr. Holloway, I'd like to discuss a company. Mercer immediately looked up. Grant remained silent. Victoria continued. Are you familiar with an entity known as Red Prairie Holdings, LLC? The reaction was instant. Not dramatic, but undeniable. Grant froze, only for a second, then recovered. The problem was that Zion saw it, Victoria saw it, Judge Hart saw it, and once a judge notices a reaction, it becomes difficult to forget. Grant cleared his throat. The name sounds familiar, Victoria nodded. Sounds familiar. Possibly. She retrieved a document. Would reviewing this refresh your memory? The document was handed to the witness. Grant studied it. Longer than he studied any previous exhibit. Finally he answered, yes. What is Red Prairie Holdings? A limited liability company. Who formed it? Mercer stood. Objection, Victoria calmly responded. Foundation will be established. Judge Hart allowed limited questioning. Grant shifted again. The movement seemed involuntary, like someone trying to find a comfortable position in an increasingly uncomfortable situation. Victoria remained patient. Mr. Holloway, were you involved in preparing financial documentation connected to Red Prairie Holdings? A pause. Yes. The answer echoed through the room. Victoria took another step forward. Were you compensated for that work? Yes. By whom? Another pause, longer this time, then the company. Victoria nodded. Reasonable. Expected. She turned toward the judge, then back toward the witness. Did you have direct contact with Rebecca Cox regarding that company? The room became completely silent. Even the gallery stopped shifting in their seats. Grant looked toward Mercer. Mercer stared straight ahead. No help coming, no escape, only the question. Grant swallowed, then answered, yes. A visible change spread through the courtroom. Not excitement, attention. Focused attention. Victoria continued. How often? Several times. Several. Over a period of months. Victoria nodded, then placed another document on the witness stand. Bank records, wire transfers, formation documents, payment authorizations, the same records she and Zion had discovered weeks earlier. Grant recognized them immediately. The recognition appeared in his eyes before he ever touched the paper. Victoria's voice remained calm. Mr. Holloway, were funds transferred into accounts associated with Red Prairie Holdings? Yes. Substantial funds? Yes. Several $100,000. Another pause. Then, yes. Judge Hart looked up from her notes. That was the first time all afternoon she had visibly reacted. Only slightly, but noticeably. Victoria let the moment settle, then asked the question she truly cared about, the question she had spent weeks preparing to ask. Mr. Holloway, was Red Prairie Holdings disclosed in Mrs. Cox's initial financial disclosures? The courtroom seemed to stop breathing. Grant looked at the document, then at the judge, then at Victoria. The answer took several seconds. When it finally came, it arrived quietly. No. Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Judge Hart slowly set down her pen. Victoria closed the folder. Not because she was finished, because she had accomplished what she needed. The existence of the company was now part of the record. The undisclosed funds were now part of the record. And most importantly, the person confirming those facts was Rebecca's own financial consultant. Victoria returned to counsel table. Zion remained perfectly still, yet internally one realization settled into place. This case was no longer about proving he supported his family. That question had already been answered. Now the focus was shifting somewhere else, toward money that had not been disclosed, toward transactions hidden behind layers of paperwork, toward questions nobody expected when the divorce began. And judging by the expression on Judge Hart's face, the next hearing was going to be very different. The discovery of Red Prairie Holdings changed everything. Until that moment, the divorce had followed a familiar pattern: claims, counterclaims, arguments about money, arguments about responsibility, arguments about perception. Now the focus shifted toward something far more dangerous: disclosure. Or more specifically, the possibility that disclosure had been incomplete. 3 days after the hearing, Judge Eleanor Hart ordered additional financial records. The directive was precise. Any accounts, companies, trusts, or financial interests connected to either party had to be disclosed completely. No exceptions, no omissions, no delays. The order landed on every attorney's desk before noon. Victoria Bennett smiled when she read it. Not because she enjoyed conflict, because clarity had finally become mandatory. That afternoon, Zion sat across from her in the conference room overlooking the Des Moines River. Several folders covered the table. Red Prairie Holdings occupied the center. Victoria tapped the file. "We need to understand exactly what this company was doing." Zion nodded. "What do we know?" Victoria opened a document. "Not much." Then another. "Yet." That single word mattered, because over the previous week, investigators had been working. Corporate filings, bank records, public registrations, property records, every available source. Piece by piece, the picture had started coming together. The company had been formed in Nebraska, specifically Omaha. The registration occurred 18 months earlier. Its ownership structure appeared intentionally layered, not illegal, but complicated. Several entities connected indirectly, limited disclosures, minimal public information. Victoria flipped another page. "What's interesting is the timing." Zion looked down at the records. The formation date aligned closely with 2 events: Rebecca's first consultations with divorce counsel and Grant Holloway's consulting agreement. Neither coincidence felt particularly convincing. Victoria noticed the same thing. "The timeline bothers me." Zion gave a faint nod. "Me too." The following week brought another round of discovery. This time, the records arrived electronically. Thousands of pages, bank statements, transfer histories, corporate filings, accounting reports. Victoria spent nearly 12 hours reviewing them. By midnight, she had identified the first major breakthrough. Money, a lot of money. Over a period of 16 months, more than $400,000 had moved through Red Prairie Holdings. Not in a single transaction, in dozens, smaller amounts, layered transfers, carefully distributed movements. The structure looked designed to avoid attention. Not necessarily illegal, but certainly deliberate. Victoria called Zion early the next morning. "I think we found something." He arrived 30 minutes later, coffee in hand, expression unchanged. Victoria handed him a summary report. He studied the pages carefully, then stopped at one particular section: transfer source, transfer destination, transfer authorization. The pattern immediately stood out. Several transfers originated from accounts connected to Rebecca. Others originated from joint accounts. Some moved through intermediary entities before reaching Red Prairie Holdings. The route appeared complex, but the destination remained consistent. "What was the purpose?" Zion asked. Victoria shook her head. "That's what I can't find. No invoices, no business activity, no operating revenue, no employees, no contracts, no legitimate commercial explanation, at least none they had discovered yet. The company existed, the money existed, but the purpose remained hidden, and hidden things tend to attract judicial attention, especially during divorce proceedings." 2 weeks later, the next hearing arrived. The courtroom looked more crowded than ever. Word had spread. Attorneys from other firms appeared in the gallery. Several observers occupied standing room near the back wall. Everyone seemed aware something significant was developing. Judge Hart entered promptly. The hearing began. This time the judge controlled the discussion from the start. "Before we address any other issues," she said, "I want clarification regarding Red Prairie Holdings. No introduction, no delay, straight to the point." Rebecca sat noticeably stiffer. Mercer adjusted several documents. Victoria remained calm. Judge Hart turned toward Mercer. "Has the company now been fully disclosed?" Mercer stood. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Ownership," Mercer answered. "The company is controlled by Mrs. Cox." Several people in the gallery exchanged glances. The answer sounded simple. Yet, it had carried consequences, because earlier disclosures had omitted the company entirely. Judge Hart continued. "When was the company formed?" Mercer provided the date, the same date Victoria had already highlighted. The judge wrote it down, then asked another question. "What is the purpose of the company?" A pause. A very noticeable pause. Mercer glanced toward Rebecca, then answered, "Asset management." Judge Hart looked unimpressed. "Specifically," another pause, longer this time. The answer lacked precision. Everyone could hear it. Victoria could hear it. Zion could hear it. Most importantly, Judge Hart could hear it. The judge turned toward Victoria. "Ms. Bennett." Victoria rose. She carried only a single folder. No dramatic stack of binders. No mountain of exhibits. Just one folder. Sometimes one folder is enough. "Your Honor, we'd like to present several financial summaries." Permission granted. The monitors activated. Charts appeared. Transfer histories, dates, amounts, movement paths, each transaction displayed visually. Easy to follow, easy to understand, very difficult to explain away. Victoria walked the court through the timeline. One transfer, then another, then another. Every route eventually pointed toward Red Prairie Holdings. Judge Hart studied the exhibits carefully. Then she noticed something. A sequence of transfers occurring shortly before Rebecca filed for divorce. The timing stood out, not because the amounts were enormous, because they clustered together, several large movements within a short period. Judge Hart pointed toward the chart. These transfers occurred within weeks of the divorce filing. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge turned toward Mercer. "Explanation." Mercer attempted one: investment planning, asset positioning, financial organization. The words sounded polished, but lacked supporting records, and Judge Hart noticed. The judge always noticed. Then Victoria introduced another document, a bank authorization form, simple, ordinary, powerful. The authorization identified who approved several transfers. Rebecca's signature appeared clearly. No dispute, no ambiguity. The courtroom grew quiet, again. Not because the document proved wrongdoing, because it proved involvement. Direct involvement. Victoria returned to counsel table. Her presentation remained restrained, measured, professional, exactly the approach Judge Hart preferred. The hearing continued for nearly 2 hours. Questions, answers, documents, clarifications. By late afternoon, one fact had become impossible to ignore. Red Prairie Holdings was real. The money was real. The transfers were real. The omission was real. The explanations, however, remained weak. As proceedings neared conclusion, Judge Hart leaned back slightly. The gesture seemed minor, yet everyone recognized it. She was thinking, carefully, methodically, the way experienced judges do when facts begin conflicting with narratives. Finally, she spoke. I have concerns. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. The courtroom waited. Judge Hart continued. The court expects complete transparency. Her eyes shifted briefly toward Rebecca, then toward Mercer, then toward the evidence. Particularly when financial disclosures are submitted under penalty of perjury. The statement landed heavily. No accusation, no ruling, just a warning. Sometimes warnings are more effective. The hearing ended shortly afterward. People gathered documents. Observers filed into the hallway. Attorneys exchanged quiet conversations. Yet one thing had changed. Before today, Red Prairie Holdings had been a mystery. Now, it had become a problem. A documented problem. As Zion exited the courthouse with Victoria's snowflakes drifted through the late afternoon air, neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Victoria broke the silence. She's losing credibility. Zion looked toward the parking garage. Maybe. Victoria stopped walking. No, her voice was firm. Definitely. Zion said nothing, because credibility was not what occupied his thoughts. Something else did. Purpose. He still didn't understand why the company existed, why the money moved, why Grant became involved. The answers remained incomplete, and incomplete answers often hide the most important truths. As they reached the garage entrance, Zion glanced back toward the courthouse. For months he had prepared for accusations, prepared for arguments, prepared for misunderstandings. What he had not expected was the growing possibility that this case concealed something much larger than a divorce, and somewhere within the remaining records, one final piece of the puzzle was waiting to be uncovered. The hallway outside courtroom 4B felt colder than the courtroom itself, not because of temperature, because of tension. The hearing had ended less than 10 minutes earlier, yet clusters of attorneys still stood near the elevators, discussing what they had witnessed. The discovery of Red Prairie Holdings had changed the tone of the case. People could debate opinions. They could debate motives. They could even debate memories. Documents were harder to debate, and Judge Eleanor Hart had made it clear she was paying attention. Zion Cox stepped into the hallway beside Victoria Bennett. Neither spoke immediately. Victoria carried 3 folders beneath one arm. Zion held nothing. He never felt the need to carry evidence personally. He trusted the preparation, trusted the records, trusted the process. That was one advantage of spending years building businesses. You learned that panic rarely improved outcomes. The hallway buzzed with quiet conversations. Court clerks moved between offices. Attorneys checked emails. Families waited for unrelated hearings. Life continued, even when someone's world felt like it was being dismantled. Victoria looked toward the elevators. I'll meet you downstairs. Zion nodded. She walked away, leaving him alone for the first time all afternoon. He moved toward a window overlooking the parking lot. Snow drifted lazily across the courthouse lawn. The city beyond looked gray and distant. For several moments he simply stood there, thinking, not about winning, not about revenge, about Logan. His son had been unusually quiet during recent months. Teenagers often hide stress, sometimes better than adults. Zion worried about that. The divorce was one thing. The effect on Logan was something else entirely. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Enjoying yourself. Rebecca. Zion turned. She stood several feet away, arms crossed, expression guarded. There was no audience now, no judge, no attorneys, just the two of them, for the first time in months. Zion looked at her calmly. What do you mean? Rebecca laughed softly. The sound carried no humor. You seem pretty satisfied. Zion said nothing. Rebecca took a step closer. All these documents. Still no answer. All this preparation. Silence. The reaction irritated her. She had always struggled with his silence. Arguments require participation. Zion rarely participated. You could have talked to me. Finally he spoke. I tried. The answer arrived quietly. Not angry, not bitter, just factual. Rebecca looked away, only briefly, then back. That's not fair. Zion did not respond, because fairness was no longer the point. The conversation stretched awkwardly. Years ago, silence between them felt comfortable. Now it felt hostile. Rebecca shook her head. You always do this. Do what? Act like you're above everything. The accusation lingered. Zion studied her for a moment, then answered. No. Rebecca waited. So what are you doing? His voice remained steady. I'm listening. That answer frustrated her even more, because it was true. Before she could respond, another voice interrupted. Dad! Both turned. Logan stood at the far end of the hallway. 16 years old, tall, athletic, still wearing a Jefferson Academy basketball jacket. His backpack hung from one shoulder. The surprise was immediate. Neither parent expected him there. Zion's attention shifted instantly. What are you doing here? Logan walked toward them. I got out early. Rebecca looked concerned. You shouldn't be here. The teenager shrugged. Why? Neither parent had a good answer. Logan glanced between them, then toward the courtroom doors. You guys were in there for 4 hours. Nobody spoke. He looked older than his age at that moment. Not physically, emotionally, like someone forced to grow up faster than expected. I wanted to see. Rebecca sighed. Logan, he interrupted gently, I know what's happening. The statement landed heavily. Because everyone knew it was true. Children always know more than adults think, especially when families are falling apart. Logan shifted his gaze toward Zion. Did everything go okay? The question sounded simple, yet beneath it sat months of uncertainty, months of tension, months of unanswered questions. Zion considered his response carefully, then answered. The truth is catching up. Logan frowned slightly. What does that mean? Zion looked through the courthouse window. Snow continued drifting across the city. Then he looked back at his son. It means facts take time. Logan remained silent. Trying to understand, Zion continued. People can say a lot of things. The teenager nodded slowly. But records don't forget. The words settled between them. Simple, direct, memorable. Rebecca looked uncomfortable, not because the statement attacked her, because it didn't. The comment existed beyond blame, beyond accusations. It described reality. Logan thought about it for several seconds, then nodded. I think I get it. Zion wasn't sure he did, but that was enough. The conversation ended there. No dramatic speeches, no emotional confrontation, just a father trying to give his son something useful to hold on to. Several minutes later, Rebecca left first, without another word. She disappeared down the hallway toward the elevators. Logan watched her go, then looked at Zion. You okay? A faint smile appeared. I'll survive. The teenager smiled back. For the first time that day, they stood together near the window, watching snow cover the courthouse steps. Neither needed to say much. Some relationships become stronger through conversation. Others become stronger through presence. This was one of those moments. Eventually, Logan left as well. Basketball practice awaited. Life continued. School continued. The world refused to pause, even during divorce, even during betrayal, even during legal battles. When the hallway finally emptied, Zion remained alone. The courthouse felt quieter now, almost peaceful. That peace lasted less than 30 seconds. A voice called from behind him, Mr. Cox! Zion turned. Grant Holloway stood several yards away. The accountant looked different than he had inside the courtroom, less confident, more tired. The strain of recent hearings showed clearly. Dark circles beneath his eyes, tension in his posture. Something else, too. Regret. Not obvious, but present. Grant glanced around the hallway, making sure nobody stood nearby, then took a few cautious steps forward. What do you want? Zion asked. Grant hesitated. For a moment it seemed he might leave. Instead he spoke quietly. I need to talk to Victoria Bennett. Zion studied him. The request felt strange, unexpected. Why? Grant looked toward the courtroom doors, then back toward Zion. I think she needs information. The statement immediately sharpened Zion's attention. What information? Grant shook his head. Not here. Silence. The two men stared at each other. Years earlier, they had worked together. Years earlier, trust existed. Now almost nothing remained. Grant finally spoke again. I'm serious. Zion noticed something important. Fear, not panic. Fear. Measured, controlled, real. The accountant lowered his voice further. There are things I should have said earlier. The hallway suddenly felt much quieter, much smaller, because Zion understood exactly what those words could mean. Information, records, explanations, possibly answers. The very answers Victoria had been searching for. Grant took a business card from his pocket, extended it. Zion accepted it. Neither man moved, neither spoke. Finally, Grant nodded once, then turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed across the nearly empty hallway. Zion watched until he disappeared around the corner. Only then did he look down at the card. A simple business card. Nothing remarkable, yet instinct told him it might become one of the most important pieces of paper in the entire case. Because people rarely ask to speak when things are going well. They ask to speak when something is about to change, and judging by the look on Grant Holloway's face, something was definitely about to change. Victoria Bennett did not like surprises, especially in litigation. Surprises often meant missing information. Missing information created risk, and risk had a way of becoming expensive. That was why she looked skeptical when Zion placed Grant Holloway's business card on her desk the next morning. The two sat inside her office overlooking the Des Moines River. A winter storm moved slowly across the city. Snow swirled between office buildings. Inside, the atmosphere felt considerably colder. Victoria picked up the card, studied it, then set it back down. He approached you. Yes. What exactly did he say? Zion repeated the conversation from the courthouse hallway, word for word. Victoria listened carefully. When he finished, she folded her arms. I don't trust him. Neither do I. Good. Silence followed. Then Victoria leaned back in her chair. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean we should ignore him. Because she understood something important. People rarely volunteer information against their own interests. If Grant wanted a meeting, something had changed. The question was why. Victoria picked up her phone. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon. Neutral location. No courtroom, no reporters, no unnecessary attention. Just a conference room at a law office. Grant arrived exactly on time. The punctuality did not surprise Victoria. Accountants tend to respect schedules. The difference was his appearance. He looked exhausted, more exhausted than he had looked in court. The strain showed clearly now. His tie sat slightly crooked. His eyes appeared tired. His hands seemed restless. Victoria immediately noticed. Zion noticed too. The conference room door closed. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Grant stared at the table. Victoria waited. Patience often produces more information than pressure. Finally, Grant broke the silence. I made mistakes. Victoria remained expressionless. What kind of mistakes? Grant exhaled slowly. The kind that become harder to live with. Not a legal answer, a personal one. Victoria noticed. That mattered. She opened a legal pad. Start at the beginning. Grant nodded. For the next hour, pieces of the story emerged, not all at once, piece by piece, carefully, reluctantly. Months before Rebecca formally filed for divorce, she contacted him. Initially, the request seemed ordinary. Financial planning, asset reviews, questions regarding potential divorce exposure. Those requests were common, nothing unusual. At first, then the conversations changed. Rebecca wanted more than information. She wanted strategy, not legal strategy, financial strategy. Specifically, she wanted documentation that minimized Zion's contributions. Victoria wrote notes continuously. Grant continued. At first he resisted, not because of loyalty, because the records did not support the narrative. The records clearly showed Zion paying the majority of household expenses. Mortgage obligations, school tuition, healthcare expenses, insurance, everything. Grant knew it. Rebecca knew it. The documents proved it. Victoria interrupted. Did she ask you to create false records? No. The answer came immediately. That mattered. False records would have been criminal. This situation was different, more subtle, more dangerous. What exactly did she ask for? Grant hesitated, then answered. She wanted emphasis. Victoria waited. Explain. Grant rubbed his forehead. She wanted reports highlighting uncertainty instead of support. Now Victoria understood. Selective presentation, not fabrication. narrative construction. A very different thing, and very common in litigation. Still troubling, still important, but different. Grant continued speaking. The more he talked, the more uncomfortable he became, because every explanation led toward the same conclusion. He had participated, not illegally, but unethically, at least in his own mind. That guilt had clearly been growing for months. Then Victoria asked the question she truly cared about. Red Prairie Holdings. Grant immediately looked down. The reaction answered part of the question before he spoke. What about it? You were involved? Yes. How involved? A long silence followed, the longest silence of the meeting. Finally, Grant answered. I helped create the structure. Victoria stopped writing. For the first time all afternoon, the statement mattered. A lot. Why? Grant looked toward Zion, then away, then back. The company wasn't originally intended for divorce planning. Then what was it for? Grant swallowed. Control. The answer confused nobody more than Zion. Control of what Victoria asked the question. Grant explained. Over time, Rebecca became increasingly frustrated by how little visibility she had into Zion's business empire. Not because he hid things maliciously, because he rarely discussed them. She wanted independence, influence, access. Red Prairie Holdings became a vehicle through which she could build separate assets. Initially, that idea seemed reasonable. Spouses often create businesses, investment entities, holding companies. Nothing unusual there. The problem emerged later, when money began moving into the company without proper disclosure, and when divorce discussions began shortly afterward. Victoria listened carefully. Everything aligned with the timeline they had already constructed. Every major event fit. Every transfer, every consultation, every decision. The puzzle pieces were finally connecting. Then Grant said something unexpected, something neither Victoria nor Zion anticipated. There are emails. Victoria looked up. What emails? Grant reached into his briefcase, removed a folder, then slowly slid it across the table. Nobody touched it immediately. The folder seemed heavier than paper should feel, because everyone understood what might be inside. Grant's voice became quieter. I saved copies. Victoria opened the folder. Printed email chains, dozens of pages, dates, attachments, conversations, planning discussions, financial summaries, nothing sensational, nothing dramatic, just correspondence. Yet correspondence has a unique quality. People tend to speak more honestly in private communications than in court. Victoria began reading. The first several messages confirmed basic financial planning. Then she reached a later chain. Her expression changed slightly, only slightly, but Zion noticed. The email included a sentence, one sentence, short, direct, damaging. We need a way to make it look like Zion wasn't carrying everything. The room became silent. Grant closed his eyes briefly. Victoria continued reading. Additional messages followed. Discussions regarding optics, perception, presentation, narrative, not evidence, narrative. Nothing explicitly fraudulent, but deeply revealing. Because the goal was no longer accuracy. The goal had become appearance. After several minutes, Victoria closed the folder, carefully, deliberately, then looked directly at Grant. Why are you giving us this now? The accountant stared at the table. For several moments he said nothing. When he finally answered, the honesty surprised everyone. Because my son stopped speaking to me. The answer felt unexpected, human, real. Grant continued quietly. He found out about the hearings. His voice tightened. He asked if I was helping someone lie. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. Grant looked older suddenly, much older. I couldn't answer him. The room fell silent again. Zion watched carefully. Not with sympathy, not with anger, simply observation. Because for the first time, Grant appeared completely honest. No positioning, no strategy, no professional language, just regret. Victoria eventually spoke. If you intend to cooperate, everything must be formal. Grant nodded. I know. No private deals. I understand. No side agreements. Another nod. I understand. Victoria pushed a document across the table. An affidavit template, formal sworn testimony, legally binding. The seriousness was obvious. Grant looked at the pages, then at Zion, then back at the document. The decision seemed difficult, yet not difficult enough. After several moments, he picked up a pen. The scratching sound echoed softly through the conference room. Line by line, paragraph by paragraph, signature, date, witness acknowledgement, notarization instructions. When he finished, he placed the pen down. Nobody celebrated, nobody smiled, because victories rarely feel triumphant when families are involved. The affidavit sat between them. Simple paper, simple ink, yet potentially powerful. For months, the case had revolved around competing stories. Now, one of the people responsible for constructing those stories had formally stepped away from them. As Grant prepared to leave, Victoria gathered the documents carefully. The emails, the affidavit, the supporting records, every page mattered. Every page would soon enter the official record. And once that happened, the next hearing would become something entirely different. Not a debate, not an argument. A reckoning. Because facts were no longer emerging one piece at a time. They were arriving all at once, and Judge Hart was about to see all of them. The final evidentiary hearing began under a clear March sky. For the first time in weeks, the snow had stopped. Sunlight reflected from the glass buildings surrounding the Polk County Courthouse. The city looked brighter. The courtroom did not. Inside courtroom 4B, tension sat heavily in the air. Everyone knew this hearing mattered, not because it would officially end the divorce, because it would determine which version of the story survived, the version built on accusations or the version built on records. Zion Cox arrived early, as always. He sat beside Victoria Bennett and quietly reviewed several exhibits, not because he needed to memorize them, because preparation had become routine. Across the aisle, Rebecca sat beside Daniel Mercer. She looked tired. The change had become increasingly noticeable over the previous month. The confidence that once seemed effortless now appeared forced. Even her posture looked different, more rigid, less certain. Judge Eleanor Hart entered exactly at 9 o'clock. The room stood, then sat. The hearing began. Victoria immediately noticed something unusual. Judge Hart already had a thick folder in front of her. The affidavit, the emails, the supplemental disclosures, everything submitted during the previous weeks. That folder alone represented months of work, months of facts, months of preparation. Judge Hart opened the hearing without ceremony. "Let's proceed." Victoria stood first. She carried only one binder. Unlike earlier hearings, there was no need for mountains of documents. Most of the evidence had already been admitted. Today was about connecting the final pieces. The courtroom monitors illuminated. A summary timeline appeared. Years of financial support displayed in chronological order. Mortgage payments, school tuition, medical expenses, insurance, property maintenance, family travel, emergency expenditures. Every category contained supporting documentation. Every category pointed to the same source: Zion. Victoria walked through the timeline carefully, methodically, never rushing, never exaggerating. The strength of evidence often increases when presented calmly. The numbers spoke for themselves. By the time she finished, the total exceeded $1.8 million, documented support over 12 years. Judge Hart reviewed the chart, then reviewed it again. No one in the courtroom missed the significance, because the central accusation had always been simple. Rebecca claimed Zion had never truly provided for the family. The records now showed something entirely different. Victoria turned toward the witness area. Grant Holloway had been recalled. This time his testimony lasted only 20 minutes. The affidavit had already been submitted. The emails had already been authenticated. Most major questions had already been answered. Still, Judge Hart wanted several points clarified directly. Grant took the oath again, then sat. Victoria approached. "Mr. Holloway, did you prepare the affidavit submitted to this court?" "Yes." "Did you review it before signing?" "Yes." "Is it accurate?" "Yes." No hesitation, no ambiguity. The answers arrived immediately. Victoria continued. "Does the affidavit accurately reflect your knowledge of Mr. Cox's financial support of the household?" "Yes." "Does it accurately describe your communications with Rebecca Cox regarding financial presentation?" A pause, then, "Yes." The courtroom remained silent. Not because the answers were surprising, because they were final. The uncertainty had largely disappeared. Judge Hart then addressed Grant directly. "Mr. Holloway." "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you dispute that Mr. Cox provided substantial financial support for his family?" "No." The answer echoed through the room, simple, clear, decisive. Judge Hart nodded, then made a note. Another piece locked into place. After Grant stepped down, attention shifted toward Rebecca. Victoria did not attack, did not raise her voice, did not dramatize anything. Instead, she asked questions, specific questions, questions tied directly to documents, the most dangerous kind. "Mrs. Cox, were you aware that Logan's tuition was paid through accounts controlled by Mr. Cox?" Rebecca looked down briefly. "Yes." A different answer than earlier hearings. Victoria continued. "Were you aware Mr. Cox paid for your mother's surgery?" "Yes." "Were you aware he paid the mortgage?" Another pause, then, "Yes." The pattern continued. Question, answer, question, answer. Each acknowledgement narrowed the gap between accusation and reality. Judge Hart watched carefully. The judge rarely interrupted, which often meant she was absorbing every detail. Then Victoria reached the emails. The room became even quieter. Printed messages appeared on the monitors. Nothing sensational, no threats, no dramatic language, just strategy discussions, perception discussions, narrative discussions. One message appeared, the same message Victoria had discovered weeks earlier. "We need a way to make it look like Zion wasn't carrying everything." The words hung on the screen. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Victoria asked only one question. "Did you write this email?" Rebecca stared at the monitor for several long seconds, then answered quietly, "Yes." No objection followed, no explanation, just acknowledgement. Judge Hart looked down at the document, then back up. The significance was obvious. The issue was no longer misunderstanding. The issue was intent. By late afternoon, the evidentiary portion of the hearing concluded. The record had become enormous. Thousands of pages, years of financial history, corporate records, bank statements, emails, affidavits, testimony, all of it now belonged to the case. Judge Hart reviewed several final notes, then looked toward Victoria. "Any concluding remarks?" Victoria stood. The courtroom waited. Her statement lasted less than 5 minutes. No emotional language, no attacks, no theatrics, just facts. She summarized 12 years of support. The financial records, the tuition, the health care expenses, the mortgage, the disclosures, the omissions. Then she sat. Mercer stood next. His argument was shorter than usual. Far shorter, because the available ground had become limited. He focused on emotional contributions, household responsibilities, non-financial considerations, important points, legitimate points, yet noticeably different from the original accusation, the accusation that Zion had never provided. That argument had largely disappeared. Judge Hart listened, then closed her folder, a signal everyone recognized. The hearing was nearly over. Only one issue remained. The judge looked toward Zion. "Mr. Cox." The room immediately focused on him. Zion looked up. Judge Hart folded her hands. "You've remained largely silent throughout these proceedings." "Yes, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Before the court takes this matter under advisement, is there anything you would like to say?" The question surprised no one. Yet the room became completely silent, because everyone wanted to hear the answer. Victoria looked toward Zion. So did Logan from the gallery. So did Rebecca. For several seconds, Zion remained still, thinking, choosing his words carefully, the way he always did. Then he slowly stood, not because he wanted attention, because the moment required it. The courtroom watched, waiting, listening. For the first time since the divorce began, Zion Cox was about to speak for himself. And judging by the silence surrounding him, everyone understood the importance of what came next. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The courtroom seemed suspended in place. Judge Eleanor Hart sat quietly behind the bench. Victoria Bennett remained still beside her client. Daniel Mercer lowered his pen. Even the observers in the gallery appeared frozen. Everyone was waiting for Zion Cox to speak. He stood slowly, not dramatically, not like a man preparing for a speech. more like a man standing to answer a simple question. The difference mattered, because Zion had never been interested in performances. He looked toward Judge Hart, then briefly toward the evidence table. Years of financial records sat there, thousands of pages, every payment, every contract, every transfer, every document. Months earlier, he might have felt the need to defend himself. Now he didn't. The records had already done most of the talking. His voice, when it finally came, was calm, steady, clear. "Your Honor, I don't have much to add." The statement immediately captured the room's attention, not because it was dramatic, because it sounded sincere. Zion continued, "I think the documents have already answered most of the important questions." Judge Hart listened carefully. Zion glanced briefly toward the gallery. Logan sat near the back, watching, listening, trying to understand everything. Then Zion returned his attention to the judge. "For most of my adult life I worked." Simple words, yet they carried weight. "I built businesses." A brief pause. "I paid bills." Another pause. "I took care of responsibilities." No anger, no bitterness, no accusation, just facts. The same facts that had appeared throughout the proceedings. "I never kept records because I expected to use them in court." Several people looked toward the stacks of evidence. The statement felt true. "Because nobody spends 12 years creating documentation for a divorce they don't expect," Zion continued. "I kept records because that's how I run businesses." Judge Hart nodded slightly. The explanation made sense. It always had. Zion folded his hands in front of him. For a moment he seemed to search for the right words, not because he was nervous, because he wanted to be precise. Then he spoke again. "The hardest part of this process wasn't the accusations." That surprised several people, especially Rebecca, Zion continued. "The hardest part was watching my son get pulled into it." Logan lowered his eyes. The courtroom remained silent. The statement carried more emotion than anything Zion had said all year. Yet even then the emotion remained controlled, measured, real. He looked briefly toward Logan, then back toward Judge Hart. "I don't want him learning that whoever talks loudest wins." Nobody interrupted, nobody shifted. The room remained completely still. "I want him to learn that facts matter." A pause. "I want him to learn that honesty matters." Another pause. "And I want him to learn that responsibility still means something." The words landed softly, yet they carried enormous weight, because everyone in the room understood exactly what he was saying, not just about the case, about life, about character, about choices. Zion's gaze moved toward Rebecca for the first time, not aggressively, not accusingly, just briefly. Then back to the judge. "I don't hate Rebecca." The statement surprised almost everyone, especially Rebecca. A flicker of emotion crossed her face, gone almost instantly, but visible. Zion continued. "We built a family together." His voice remained calm. "We raised a son together." A long pause. "I wish things had turned out differently." Nothing more. No blame, no attack, no attempt to embarrass her. The simplicity made the words more powerful because they sounded honest. For several seconds the courtroom remained silent. Then Zion sat down. That was it. No dramatic conclusion, no grand speech, just a few minutes, a few carefully chosen sentences, and somehow they carried more weight than hours of argument. Judge Hart looked down at her notes, then at the evidence, then at Zion. The judge had spent decades listening to people speak in courtrooms. She had heard rehearsed speeches, emotional speeches, manipulative speeches, performative speeches. What she had just heard was different. The hearing formally concluded shortly afterward. Judge Hart announced that she would review the final submissions before issuing her ruling. No immediate decision, no dramatic ending. The legal process rarely worked that way. People slowly gathered their papers. The courtroom began emptying. Attorneys discussed schedules. Court staff organized exhibits. Observers drifted towards the exits. Yet something had clearly changed. Not in the evidence. The evidence had already been strong, in perception, because for the first time everyone had heard directly from the man at the center of the case, and what they heard did not match the image that had been presented months earlier. The image of a husband who contributed nothing. The image of a man living off appearances. That version had collapsed. Several weeks later, everyone returned for the ruling. Courtroom 4B was quieter this time. The tension felt different. Less uncertainty, more anticipation. Judge Hart entered. The room stood, then sat. The judge opened a thick folder. The final order, months of litigation summarized into a legal decision. She reviewed several pages before speaking. Her voice remained professional, measured, direct. The court has reviewed testimony, financial records, affidavits, exhibits, and supplemental disclosures. No one moved. The evidence demonstrates substantial financial support provided by Mr. Cox throughout the marriage. Rebecca stared straight ahead. Judge Hart continued. The court does not find credible the claim that Mr. Cox failed to provide for his family. The statement landed like a stone dropped into still water. Not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to ignore. Judge Hart referenced the financial records, the tuition payments, the healthcare expenses, the mortgage history, the documented support. Each point reinforced the same conclusion. The evidence spoke clearly. Then the judge addressed the disclosure issues, Red Prairie Holdings, the omitted financial information, the incomplete reporting. Judge Hart's tone grew firmer. The court expressed serious concern regarding disclosure failures. The concern influenced portions of the ruling. Financial allocations shifted accordingly, not as punishment, as consequence, a crucial distinction. When the ruling concluded, one fact stood above everything else. Zion's credibility remained intact. Rebecca's had not. The hearing ended. People slowly stood, chairs moved, papers gathered, conversations resumed, yet one moment remained. Rebecca looked toward Zion. For several seconds, neither spoke. No words were necessary, because the lesson had already become clear. For years she had judged him by appearances, the old truck, the simple clothes, the quiet personality, the refusal to brag. She assumed those things meant weakness, lack of ambition, lack of importance. Now she understood something she should have understood long ago. The quietest person in the room is not always the least prepared. Sometimes they're the most prepared of all. As Zion gathered his coat and prepared to leave, Logan appeared beside him. The teenager looked relieved, for the first time in months. And as father and son walked toward the courthouse exit together, the spring sunlight waiting outside felt brighter than it had in a very long time. But the final chapter of Zion Cox's story would not be written inside a courtroom. It would be written somewhere much quieter, somewhere far more important, back where everything started. 3 months after the final ruling, most people had stopped talking about the Cox divorce. Court cases rarely stay interesting for long. New stories appear. New scandals emerge. New headlines replace old ones. Life moves forward. For Zion Cox, that was exactly what he wanted. The legal battle was over. The paperwork had been signed. The property division had been finalized. The court orders had been entered. The arguments had ended, at least officially. On a warm June evening, Zion stood alone inside his furniture restoration workshop on the east side of Des Moines. The building looked exactly as it had years earlier. The same brick walls, the same concrete floors, the same scent of sawdust and wood stain, the same workbenches worn smooth by decades of use. Many people still assumed the workshop was his primary source of income. Zion never bothered correcting them. He never had. Outside, traffic moved along the nearby street. Inside, the workshop felt peaceful. A radio played softly in the background. Sunlight streamed through the high windows. Dust floated through the golden light. For the first time in a very long time, Zion felt something unfamiliar, quiet. Not the silence of courtrooms, not the silence of tension, real quiet. The kind that arrives when a difficult chapter finally ends. A truck pulled into the parking lot. A moment later, the workshop door opened. Logan stepped inside. Now 17. Taller than ever, broader shoulders, more confident. A young man standing somewhere between childhood and adulthood. Zion looked up from the workbench. "You're late," Logan laughed. "Coach kept us after practice." The answer sounded familiar. Years earlier, Zion might have worried about missing moments with his son. The divorce had changed that, not by damaging the relationship, by clarifying it. Father and son spent more time together now than they had in years, not because a court ordered it, because both chose it. Logan dropped his backpack beside the wall, then looked toward the project sitting on the workbench, an old oak dining table. The surface was scratched. Several joints needed repair. One leg had partially separated from the frame. Most people would have considered it junk. Zion saw possibility. Logan grinned. The table again. The table again. The teenager shook his head. You've been working on this thing forever. Good work takes time, Logan laughed. That's your answer for everything. Maybe it was. Zion picked up a sanding block, handed another to Logan. Without another word, they started working. That was how many of their conversations happened now, not face-to-face, side-by-side, hands busy, minds clear. The workshop filled with the sound of sandpaper moving across wood grain, steady, rhythmic, comfortable. After several minutes, Logan spoke. Mom called yesterday, Zion continued sanding. What did she want? Just checking in. The answer carried no tension, no anger, no resentment. Time had softened some wounds, not erased them, softened them. Rebecca had moved into a condominium near downtown Des Moines. She had rebuilt portions of her life. The divorce had cost her financially and emotionally. But she was moving forward, just like everyone else. Logan worked quietly for a few moments, then asked another question. Do you ever regret not fighting harder? Zion stopped sanding, not because the question upset him, because it deserved an honest answer. He looked at the old table, then at his son. About what? The house. The answer came quickly. The large house in West Des Moines, the house many people expected him to battle over. The house he ultimately let go. Logan continued. A lot of people thought you'd keep it. Zion smiled slightly. A house is just a house. The teenager frowned. It was worth a lot. Everything is worth something. Logan considered that, then nodded slowly. Zion returned to sanding. The question is whether it's worth the cost. That answer stayed in the air. Simple, yet meaningful. The house would have required more fighting, more legal fees, more conflict, more bitterness. He already had enough of those things. What he wanted instead could not be purchased. Peace, time, a relationship with his son. No court could award those things. They had to be built, just like businesses, just like trust, just like old furniture. One careful step at a time. The afternoon slowly drifted toward evening. Sunlight moved across the workshop floor. The radio continued playing quietly. Neither father nor son felt any need to fill every silence. Some silences are empty, others are full. This one felt full. Eventually, Logan stepped back from the table. The repair looked good, not finished, but close, much closer than before. Looks better, Zion nodded. It does. Logan brushed sawdust from his hands, then leaned against the workbench. You know something? What? The teenager smiled. For a while I thought everybody was right. Zion looked up. About what? About you. The words carried no malice, only honesty. Logan continued. I thought maybe you really didn't care. The workshop became quiet. Zion listened, as he always did. I never saw the bills. Logan shrugged. I never saw the paperwork. A small smile appeared. I just saw an old truck and a guy who talked about wood all the time. Zion laughed. A real laugh. Rare, unexpected. Logan laughed too. Then his expression became serious. But now I get it. The words mattered more than any courtroom victory, more than any ruling, more than any financial judgment. Because this had always been the thing Zion cared about most. His son understanding who he actually was, not who other people claimed he was, not who appearances suggested he was, who he really was. Logan picked up his backpack. I should go. Dinner. Coach's team dinner. Zion nodded. The teenager headed toward the door, then stopped. For a moment he stood there, thinking. Finally he spoke. I'm proud of you, Dad. The statement caught Zion completely off guard. Logan smiled awkwardly, then quickly disappeared through the doorway before the conversation could become uncomfortable. The workshop became quiet again. truly quiet. Zion stood alone beside the old table. For several moments he simply looked at the open doorway, then back at the project. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. Golden light spilled across the parking lot, across the city, across the workshop floor. Years earlier, people looked at Zion and saw a man who appeared ordinary. A small business owner, an old truck, simple clothes, quiet habits. They mistook simplicity for weakness, silence for ignorance, modesty for failure. The courtroom had corrected some of those assumptions. Life corrected the rest. Because the most valuable things he ended up keeping were never listed on financial statements, not the companies, not the properties, not the investments. The things that mattered most were harder to measure: his integrity, his reputation, his relationship with Logan, the peace that came from knowing the truth had survived. As the last sunlight faded through the workshop windows, Zion switched off the radio, turned off the lights, locked the front door, then stood for a moment beside his old Ford Ranger. The same truck, the same man, just a little older, a little wiser, and no longer carrying the weight of needing to prove anything to anyone. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove home beneath a sky painted gold by the setting sun. Some people spend years trying to convince the world they are valuable. Others spend those same years quietly building a life that proves it. Zion's story reminds us that appearances can be misleading. The loudest voice is not always the most truthful, and the person who looks ordinary may be carrying responsibilities nobody else sees. In the end, the documents mattered, but so did something deeper: patience, discipline, and the willingness to let facts speak when emotions run high. Many people watching this story have probably experienced something similar. Maybe you've been underestimated. Maybe someone judged you based on what they could see instead of what you were actually carrying. Maybe you've worked hard in silence while others took credit, questioned your effort, or misunderstood your intentions. If so, this story is a reminder that truth has a way of surfacing over time. Not always quickly, not always easily, but eventually. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where people believed the wrong story about you until the facts finally came out? Share your experience in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and join us again tomorrow for another powerful story about resilience, character, and the moments when truth changes everything.